So I see this T-shirt the other day. On the front it says, dated Lamont, and on the back it says, married Malloy. Oh, welcome to Progressive Soup. My name is David Stevenson. Emily Volpentesta and I, co-hosts. Our guest, Dan Malloy.
Great to be with you.
Mayor of Stamford until he did not run for re-election, and now a candidate for governor of the state of Connecticut.
I am indeed, and excited about it. And, you know, I spent a period of time in the exploratory stage, traveling the state. I've been to about 125 Democratic town committees around the state, crisscrossing the state. I think I've put 30,000 miles on my car since December, and it's just going well. And I'm excited. I think Connecticut's ready for change. We've had Republican governors for a long time. I think we're going to finally elect a Democratic governor. Me.
Yeah, that's great.
Go ahead.
Well, thanks, Dan. What I'm interested in is your personal education, and how has this affected your attitudes about Connecticut's educational programs?
Well, you know, I talk about the way I grew up, which was a little bit differently than other people. I was born with some fairly severe physical disorders or disabilities, as well as language processing disabilities. When I was an infant, I was spastic in my coordination. I didn't develop good hand-eye coordination, gross or fine motor control. For instance, I couldn't button a shirt or tie a shoe until I was late in 5th grade. And you know, and I had to have therapy for those and treatments. But by the time I was in 8th grade, I had overcome most of the physical impairments, and then, you know, that took care of itself. But I was also born with severe what were, you know, learning disabilities, dyslexia, and other language processing disabilities. I was thought to be mentally retarded by some, as that term was then used, and you have to be very careful, as late as the 4th grade. And I didn't have a level of academic success commensurate with my abilities probably until I was in high school. Certainly not until I was in high school. I was very fortunate. I had a mother who understood that what professionals were saying about her youngest son, her 8th child, wasn't true. She made a very important decision to concentrate on the things that I had strength in as opposed to the things that I had weaknesses in. And I think it made all the difference. It allowed me to mature and develop compensatory skills throughout the time that I was growing up, right through college and law school. When I went away to college in 1973, that tells you how old I am, 54, I was still listening to my textbooks and most materials on recorded books for the blind. And I did that right through probably the beginning or midway of my 2nd semester my sophomore year. And I stayed at Boston College, and I graduated magna cum laude. I stayed for law school and graduated from law school. I took a job in New York City, so I knew I had to take the New York bar exam, which is one of the toughest bar exams to be admitted as a lawyer. That same summer, 1980, I took the Massachusetts bar exam. In both states, I was the first person to take the essay portions of those bar exams orally, who wasn't otherwise blind. And then a year later, when I took the Connecticut bar exam, because I knew I would eventually come back to Connecticut, it's where my family lived, my parents, and I was the first person in Connecticut to take the bar exam orally, the essay portion, that wasn't otherwise blind. So, you know, I've had this experience of overcoming adversity and developing appropriate compensatory skills, and it certainly has shaped who I am as a person. Certainly shaped my attitudes about public education, which I support very greatly. I have to tell you that without a great government supplying wonderful schools and therapists and psychologists and social workers, you know, I wouldn't be here today. I wouldn't have gone to law school. I wouldn't have been a prosecutor for a period of time in New York City. I wouldn't have tried 23 felony cases and had convictions in 22 of them. I wouldn't have gone back home and served on the Board of Finance and the Board of Education and served as mayor of Stamford for 14 years. So clearly I am shaped by those very early experiences in my life.
So an old man of 54, huh?
Yeah, getting old.
I'm an old man of 56.
Oh, there you go. There you go. So, but you know, I think that I have the vitality necessary to do this job. I love to work, and in Connecticut, you're going to have to love to work if you want to be governor. Connecticut is in big trouble, and I think that people need to focus that we've really dug ourselves a very deep hole. Democrats and Republican leadership has failed the state. I tend to call it a bipartisan train wreck. I hold both parties responsible. I happen to be a Democrat, but I don't think anyone's covered themselves in glory, and I want to be viewed as a change agent. So I'm not tied to defending what's wrong in any of the systems. We've got to begin growing jobs in this state, something that we haven't done since 1989. We've got to move forward on reforming public educational system. We've got to take a serious look at our tax policies to make sure that we're not making it more difficult for jobs to remain in our state. We need a governor who's going to do battle with electric rates, which I think is the largest reason that we've lost jobs in the state of Connecticut. So there's more than enough work to do in the years to come.
Yeah, you were saying you were misquoted in your Stanford Advocate article here, saying that you would cut state workforce and combine agencies to save money, and you were saying, in fact, that's not...
No, what I said, and have said across the state, is that there is a portion of government which is called the partisan side or the appointed side. It is non-civil service. It is non-unionized. It's the folks that the governor appoints to positions and brings in. It brings in with he or she. What I've said is, as a demonstration of my desire to make change, that partisan portion of government needs to be cut back by 15%. I do that because I believe, as governor, I'm going to have to demonstrate true leadership, so that's what I talk about. With respect to state agencies, there are 220 or so state agencies, which is a lot of state agencies, and I am going to be on the looking for opportunities to cut the number of agencies by combining agencies so that there is less management and more work being done. So I'm not at war with anyone, except that I have a great desire to create efficiencies, to eliminate what is, I think, in many cases, an overmanaged workforce. What we need to do is empower the state employees to make their own decisions. We need to support them and defend them. We need to give them the technology and the training necessary to get their job done. That's what I did as mayor of Stanford, and the people I worked with in Stanford rewarded us by creating efficiencies that allowed us to do some amazing things in Stanford. Lower crime by 64%, making Stanford one of the 10 safest cities in America. In a state that hadn't added jobs, we added over 5,000 jobs while I was mayor. In a state that didn't build much housing, we built thousands of units of housing and required 10% of all new housing to be set aside as affordable. In a state that has not reformed education, we created universal pre-kindergarten learning experiences, and we created the first commission in the state to examine and make recommendations on how to close the achievement gap. I did that over 8-9 years ago. I did universal pre-K 11 years ago. But I would not have been able to do any of those things if we had not made Stanford, I want to make Connecticut now, but Stanford's government more efficient.
Oh. So you want to make Stanford's government...
I want to make Connecticut's government. I made Stanford's government more efficient, so I want to use that level of experience that I had as a mayor of a major United States city, and arguably one of the most successful cities in America. I want to apply those lessons, $500 million budget, over 14 years of time, on budget, adding jobs. I want to take that experience and apply it to a small New England state that also happens to be quite diverse.
How about medical malpractice? What are your views on...
Well, medical malpractice is bad. I mean, you know, the reality is we don't want doctors and hospitals and treating physicians and anyone making mistakes. And so I think when you talk about medical malpractice, it's always a balancing act to maintain a system that makes it less likely that malpractice will be committed. On the other hand, doesn't swing so far as to make it impossible for people to practice practice in a reasonable way their profession. And so I think there's constantly a balance. In that discussion, you'll frequently hear, well, we want an absolute limitation on pain and suffering. And usually what the docs say, and a lot of my friends are docs, well, we want $250,000 to be the limit. Well, let's be realistic. $250,000 is a number that California used 30 years ago. I mean, we've got to move beyond what we were doing 30 years ago as we look at reforming the system of justice, which is obligated to make sure that we cut down on the malpractice, but also not overburden the system. So we need to look at practical ideas. If we're going to look at limitations, they would have to be reasonable limitations. But we should also look at some of the things that other states are being successful in. Specialized courts, for instance, specialized trained judges to handle medical malpractice cases, arbitration panels that are asked to render an opinion very early in the handling of the case about whether it's a reasonable case to be brought and under what circumstances it should be brought. And, by the way, is it a reasonable case to be settled early as opposed to languish for 5 or 6 years? See, I think that we can make medical malpractice more the handling of the system and the decision making much more a much quicker process, lowering cost and improving medical care in our state. So I'm open to ideas.
Okay. Let me think here. Anything else, David, you'd like to?
Yeah, I think you mentioned about the job growth in Stamford relative to the rest of Connecticut. You mentioned some other things that you accomplished. Crime being down in Stamford over your term pretty dramatically. But you also, I think, mentioned something about energy use within the government of Stamford and how that went over those 14 years when we know that energy use all over the country is just dramatically risen. Yeah, well, one of the things one of the things that's wrong with Connecticut is that we are currently paying a 76% premium on the cost of electricity over the average cost of electricity in the United States. So I want to be very clear. We're not paying a 76% premium over the lowest cost. Tennessee, for instance, is selling electricity about 3 cents per kilowatt hour, which is probably the lowest. While we're
Tennessee Valley Authority involved in that?
Absolutely.
So hydro-generated, okay.
And built out a long time ago, versus what we have been paying, which is in the 20 to 21.5 cent range. So just look at the difference in cost. Now, less than a generation ago, Connecticut was paying a 35% premium. So that premium has exploded to 76%. Yeah. It is, in my opinion, one of the reasons that we've lost more manufacturing jobs than any other state in New England or the Mid-Atlantic. It's something that we need a governor who's going to wrestle with and change. Now, some of the things that I did as mayor was to lower the city's consumption of energy. And I did it because a friend of mine, a guy who's gone on to win Academy Awards and a Nobel Peace Prize, Al Gore, asked me to go to a conference because this was in the 90s at Columbia University. He called me one day. He said, "Mayor, we forgot to invite municipal leaders. I know you're nearby. Would you do me a favor and go to this conference at Columbia University, 2-day conference?" And I was more than happy to go. I was not a climate change guy at the time, and I came back a changed person. And so we moved our city in the direction of become knowledgeable and do everything we could to reduce our energy consumption. So we took our carbon footprint of city and Board of Education buildings in 1998. Between 1998 and 2009, we added another 3,000 computers in those buildings. And yet we had still reduced our carbon footprint by 19% by doing some pretty extraordinary things, whether it was lighting and heating and ventilation and changes in behavior and systems that automatically turned off computers and lights and that sort of thing. But we reduced our carbon footprint for those buildings by 19%. I think that that's one of the things that Connecticut needs to do. I think if we had a governor who led the charge, say, say, to lower electric consumption by 15%, what you would see is the marketplace respond by lower prices. And so I want to do that. And I have a couple of other ideas that we should do. One of the things that I advocate, and have been for years, is that we should require our utility companies, gas and electric, to tell us, I mean, they should continue to tell us how our consumption compares to a month ago or a year ago. But what it really should also do is tell us how our consumption compares to a similarly sized housing unit. And the reason, let's assume you have a 1,000 square foot housing unit, an apartment, a townhouse, a house. If you know, because your bill tells you that you're using 30% more than the average similarly sized household, you're going to change your behaviors. See, knowledge of information, of facts, changes behaviors. Right now, our citizens don't have the knowledge necessary to motivate them to change their behaviors. That one little change, and by the way, in every town and city across the state, there is a listing of how big everyone's housing unit is. We require that information to be maintained for valuation purposes. Take that piece, load it in the computer, then do a survey. What's the average usage? Tell people. I'm telling you, they'll change their behavior. Another idea, in a relatively short period of time, every home operated hot water heater should have a timer on it. You should be able to, with the flick of a switch, say, I'm going to turn this unit off between the hours of 8:30 in the morning and and 5 o'clock at night, or between the hours of 9 o'clock at night and 5 in the morning. The amount of electricity we'd save is significant.
Now, on a related subject, now, and Emily's been in Italy for the better part of 8 years, between 2000 and 2008. How about alternative energy development in Connecticut? Because Italy and all of Europe seem to be far ahead of us in alternative energy development. What are our prospects here in Connecticut with solar power, with the water coming in and out of Long Island Sound? What are our prospects with that?
Well, I think that I want to be very clear that we have great solar potential. We are roughly, our solar potential is on par with Germany, for instance. And Germany is far ahead of us in the generation of solar power, particularly for home ownership uses. So solar panels attached to homes, generating electricity, generating hot water. Very common in Germany, not common at all here. We have to look at our zoning regulations. We have to make it easier for people to install these systems. We should even look at some incentives to do that. And on the wind, we have portions of our state that would be good generators of wind energy, windmill-generated electricity. Again, I think we should be working with local communities, encouraging them to change their own internal zoning policies to make it easier to say, add a wind farm to a dairy farm. Help the dairy farmer by taking a portion of that property and adding windmills. Makes a lot of sense. A lot of these dairy farmers are producing milk at prices not recovering their costs for their sale. This is something we should be taking a very serious look at. With respect to Long Island Sound, which you mentioned, the history of Connecticut is Long Island Sound. Connecticut was developed as an industrial center because we had all of these ponds or areas that could be dammed relatively close to Long Island Sound, which has a rather dramatic drop in tide. Once cheaper energy came along, burning of coal, fossil fuels, and others, we got away from that. I think that there is potential with respect to generating by the flow of water in our rivers or in and out of the Sound electricity. We should be spending some money and doing some of those things. But I also want to argue that these are job creators. Some of the things that we could be doing are job creators. Some of the technologies, for instance, fuel cell technology, is a Connecticut technology. And we should be investing in fuel cell technology in Danbury and Torrington and East Hartford and elsewhere. One of the things that I am critical of the governor for having done, Governor Rell, she took a lot of the stimulus money and she's spending it in other states, buying buses, for instance, in Indianapolis, $90 million worth. Imagine if we had placed orders for fuel cell technology and distributed those to municipalities in the state for the generation of electricity, clean air, renewable resource, lowering costs, and employing people to build the fuel cells. Not a bad connection for the state of Connecticut.
Now, I'd like to ask you about your attempts. You're just speaking about municipalities. Your attempts to remedy education funding. municipalities?
I think what people have to understand about Connecticut is that we fund the flow of dollars from state government to local government in support of education is substantially below the national average. So you take the 50 states, you draw a line at the average. Connecticut is about 17% less than the national average in its state government support of local pre-K through 12 education. And that all grew up over the last generation, over the last 20 years. It's unacceptable. It's one of the reasons that property taxes are unacceptably high in many of our communities. It's, I think, the largest reason why in this last September we started school with 1,200 fewer teachers than we had the year before, and we're probably looking at starting school this coming September with 2,000 to 2,500 fewer teachers than we started this year. This is a disaster. We should be moving in the direction, particularly in urban areas, of having smaller classrooms and more resources devoted to helping children who are in various states of failure or are behind, as opposed to be cutting teachers. So one of the things that I think we have to do is be less reliant on property taxes within our communities, have our state government ultimately at least support local education expenses on par with the rest of the nation, and start to distribute access to other tax systems to local governments. I'll give you, for instance, we're here in Danbury. We're taping the show. One of the largest producers of sales tax of all the municipalities in the state is Danbury, because of the Great Mall and other retail outlets. None of that money generated by those facilities, the sale tax revenue, stays in the community. None of the income tax paid by the individuals working in those facilities stays in the community. People stay in hotel rooms in Danbury. None of the overnight tax stays in the community in which that room is located. And yet, if you went across the country, you would find the sharing of one of those taxes almost universally, and maybe all of them. Another tax that's routinely distributed in other states to local communities is an add-on or a portion of the utility tax. Doesn't happen in the state of Connecticut. So we are overly dependent on property taxes, and we have a state government that doesn't distribute its fair share of dollars to support education. We end up in a mess as a state, and when there's a downturn, and we're certainly in a downturn, it becomes aggravated by the fact that we did, in the best of times, Connecticut had bad public policy. In the worst of times, that bad public policy becomes evident to everyone. It's as if everyone was able to put on glasses and tell that the emperor suddenly had no clothes. But the emperor had no clothes the last 10 years.
So, as governor, would you help fix the situation of putting the tax dollars back in the community?
Yeah, we have to restructure Connecticut's finances, A, to pay our own bills in state government, but also with an eye that the most burdensome tax in the state of Connecticut is the property tax. It's one of the reasons, again, that manufacturers leave. I would say the obligation of local property taxes and the obligation of paying that 76% premium on electricity is one of the largest. Those two things together, along with a faltering transportation system, actually those three things, that's why we lose jobs, period. I mean, you could say overdependence on property taxes, electric rates that are sky high, and a transportation system that doesn't meet our needs. All of those things have been ignored by state government, Democrats, Republicans, for a long period of time. It's why Connecticut is in a job crisis. It's why our legislature has a yearly debate about what programs to cut and how much to raise taxes. In the best of times and in the worst of times, that's been Connecticut's government. It's time for a change.
Now, the local representative, Jason Bartlett, recently was in the paper, in the Danbury paper, talking about putting more, what do you call it, special advanced courses, advanced placement courses in schools where kids are underperforming, in inner city schools particularly, putting more advanced placement courses in schools. And he made a pretty valid argument about that kids will live up to the expectations that are laid on them. Relate that to what you see around the state.
Well, I think there's a level of validity to what the representative is saying, that the absence of advanced placement courses is not necessarily reflective of the inability of the students to do that higher level work, but more often reflective of the inability of the school district to pay for that. So systems find ways to save money. Advanced placement courses are more expensive. You have to bring in additional faculty for that purpose. And in many of our systems across the state, the first things to go, or in our poorer systems, the last thing to be created are advanced placement courses. I would also say that we have got to lift expectations for all of our students. We shouldn't have one set of expectations for people living in poverty or along racial lines, or my favorite, along home ownership lines, than we do the people who are on the other side of those equations. We should have high expectations for everyone. And by the way, our expectations should be raised every single year. I mean, that's how you create a first-class, world-class educational system. Connecticut is routinely ranked at near the bottom on a statewide basis when it comes to math and sciences and the like, the technical education. And it's because we're not paying attention. And in part, I think that's the frustration that you heard Jason talk about.
Okay.
I know that the younger generation, like a lot of people in small towns in Connecticut, they find that as they come to retirement, they can't afford to stay in Connecticut, and they'll have to move maybe downtown, down south. How do you see that coming? Do you think future generations? I'm from Bethel, and someday I might not be able to stay here. Do you see that ever changing due to property taxes or the rate of living becoming too expensive?
I'll second that. How do we keep our kids here? How do we keep our young people here in Connecticut?
Well, the easiest way to keep young people in Connecticut is to go back on offense and create jobs, which we haven't done for 20-plus years. And I think that's the biggest failure. There are other things we can do about making life easier in our urban areas, including building more affordable housing and making those communities more desirable by lowering crime. I also would say to you that senior citizens suffer mightily under the cost of electricity, just like manufacturers do. With respect to senior citizens, our over-reliance on property taxes, these are the folks senior citizens living on fixed incomes, is extremely burdensome. Their incomes are not going up, and yet we have a state tax structure that raises their property taxes, their largest single tax, more aggressively than any other tax in the state. So they're disproportionately affected by the property taxes. I will also say to you that people make decisions when many people will make decisions about where they are in what stage of their life and how big their unit of housing is.
I got to jump in because we were down to our last 30 seconds. I have one more question for you, Dan, and one more question for you, Emily.
Okay.
For you, will you concede that I'm a young 56 if I concede you're a young 54?
I will concede that at 54 I'm younger than you are.
And to our resident medical expert.
Okay.
If you had to choose between, in an emergency situation, choose between employing the richest doctor or the most qualified doctor